Hey, Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, all praises going on to Yahweh Bashem Shai, Bashem Akakwadash, the honors to the apostles and the elders who are millstone for teaching us his truth. And salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquas that may listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Okwai, and back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, it's going to be a little bit about character and accountability, and essentially, I guess, the importance of accountability, and sometimes something just, was just doing a little bit of self-reflection, coupled with some experience, 'cause sometimes, having, this wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, and one of the things that comes with it is that it can puff you up, and essentially you might think of yourself very, very highly, right? As a matter of fact, I want to start off with I guess I'll start off with that in Romans. Okay, this is Romans 12, verse 3, and it says, "For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but think soberly, according as the Most High hath dealt to every man the measure of faith." Right? So, this just from self-examination and observation, one of the things, and I'm sure other brothers can attest to this also, is that one of the things that occurs when you have knowledge, wisdom, and understanding is that it can puff you up, right? And I guess one of the things I also wanted to touch on was this sentiment of accountability, right? And pretty much, knowing that even though we may have, we may have understanding, the Lord has opened up our minds to, it doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes. And even though we do make mistakes, is, admitting that we did make a mistake, right? And this just comes from, some self-examination, as well as, and I guess some experience also, because, for a lot of people, especially our people, when they have a lot of, I guess, substance, so to speak, they think they can do absolutely no wrong, and there's a sentiment of pride that is over, the people, especially in this kingdom, in this society, right? So that's pretty much the premise, but, I want to bring out a couple precepts. Excuse me. And, Lord's will, this lesson will be edifying. This is just one of those, I guess you could say like a character, development, because character truly goes a long way. Something that, observed about, I've observed, it really does, it goes a long way, pretty much. And then part of that character is just being accountable, because we recognizing we have faults and we make mistakes, but be able to do, like, if you make a mistake, you apologize, and and then essentially move on, right? This is what was that? This is Sirach 21, verse 7. And it says, an eloquent man is known far and near, but a man of understanding knoweth when he slippeth, right? So an eloquent man is somebody who essentially is able to speak well. He's able to convey his thoughts, his opinions, his ideas in a very, I guess, a fancy fashion. He might have a very elaborate vocabulary. When you think about speakers, for example, like Martin Luther King or even Malcolm X, these people were very, very excellent orators. They would be able to, convey their points very expressively. Now, not necessarily that's not going to be the same case, with prophets and the men of the Lord. They're not going to be very, very eloquent people. You know what I'm saying? But the point is really about what it is they say, not how the message is actually delivered, right? Because even Paul said to himself, well, not to himself, but he said that he may be rude in speech, but not in knowledge, right? So, the point here is in where was I? 7, and it says, "A man of understanding knoweth when he slippeth," right? So, you make mistakes, and then essentially, you're able to, rebound, right? And this is all part of, like, I guess you can say, proper development, proper character development, because one of the things that even for myself I'm guilty of is essentially when you get so hasty into wanting to know a lot of the deeper things, and not having to try and get more deeper understanding in regards to certain things and certain information, that can also lead to neglecting a lot of even the simple things. And I'm just using accountability just really as an example. Other brothers might can speak on other topics, but certain things that is really just healthy and important for like, for example, like a child's development. When you think about a child's development, for those first couple months, after the birth, children, they need the essentials. They need they need that milk. Well, scriptures go into sincere milk, essentially, right? But they need that milk, right? And that milk, I believe it's called colostrum, if I'm not mistaken, that they get from the woman's breast, right? That milk is so heavily, it's so very important. You get your fats, your proteins, your carbohydrates, and another thing is you even get that what's it called? Essentially that protection, for immune system, essentially against diseases and so on and so forth, right? So that milk is very, very important, and part of expressing that good development is accountability, because, it's one thing to essentially know like a lot of things, but then again, it's a flip side if you know a lot of things and then, you offend, right? And then, you can't apologize for, making a mistake, because, we make mistakes too, right? That's why we have a physician, right? We need a physician. Like scriptures say, well, Yahweh even said it, they that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick, right? So, we still, make mistakes. And the scriptures do say as well that a righteous man falleth 7 times and get back up, right? To roughly paraphrase, right? So the point is accountability in the sense of molding proper character. Yes, we have faults, and then we essentially try to what's the word I'm looking for? Rebound, so to speak. Basically, being able to, okay, if you cause, some type of, you I don't want to say offend, but if you essentially, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess I would say offend, for lack of better words, right? And it was done. It was an honest mistake. You essentially you apologize and seek forgiveness, and essentially you move on, right? And that is a sentiment that you'd want good, essentially, children to have that type of mindset. Like if you're raising a young child, and they, like, say for example, they have a sibling, and they're playing, for example, and they hit the sibling, they hit one of their siblings too hard. One of the things you want your children to do is to apologize. The children that because they didn't do it maliciously. That's really the point here as well. They don't want to. They did something. It was an accident. It was an honest mistake, right? That's really kind of mostly what I'm talking about here, right? So those kinds of things, that's so important for children's development. So how much more for like us as well, because this society it promotes that a more that sentiment of pride. And the scriptures talk about how pride is one of those things that the Lord hates, right? And when pride is one of those things also, when as a matter of fact, let me get it, you know. What's that? Sirach chapter 10. Let's see here. Sirach 10 and 12, and it says, the beginning of pride is when one departeth from the Most High Yahweh, and his heart is turned away from his Maker, right? So, that is the sentiment that, this place, Babylon, essentially encapsulates. It's engulfed in, great pride, because these people think that they can absolutely, that they can do no wrong, so to speak, right? Coming to this truth, you realize that, we realize we're in this condition as a whole because we as a people, we messed up, right? So, hopefully, this is, piecing together and actually making sense, right? In terms of proper accountability, and it's essentially it's a good character, healthy character, right? Where was I going to go? Okay, let me get this here. Okay, this is Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, and it came to pass in the month of Chisleu, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the palace, that Hanani, one of my brethren, he and certain men of Judah, I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they sent unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province, are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted, and prayed before the Most High Yahweh of heaven, and said, I beseech thee, O Lord, power of heaven, Yahweh, the great and terrible power, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. So, Nehemiah, he's he hears of the situation. As a matter of fact, I'll make my commentary, and then let me just read this next verse. Here's the point I want to really hit here, but kind of want to set the tone. It says, let thine ear now be attentive and thy eyes open, and thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now day and night for the children of Israel, thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned, right? So Nehemiah understood that, he was in a situation, there are people who are in a situation, including himself, because they were in that situation because they transgressed against the Lord. They realized that, oh man, this is happening because we messed up. We departed from the ways of our Heavenly Father, right? And stopped following his laws and his statutes, his commandments, right? All right. And then what happened? What was the byproduct of not doing that? A series of curses. When you read the Deuteronomy, the 28th, from the 15th down to like the 68th verse, all these were a laundry list of curses that would fall upon us, if we didn't hearken unto the voice of the Lord, right? So the point I really wanted to drive home here is the fact that, Nehemiah didn't essentially excuse himself from, what's it called, being accountable, from, essentially he was in that spirit of acknowledging, I have sinned also, right? We are in a position as a whole because we sinned against Heavenly Father. He acknowledged that, and that is one of the things that is, our people, can't do. They can't acknowledge we are in this condition because we messed up, right? They can't, it kind of, because, it forces them to kind of look at themselves, right? When you do that, but, our people can't really look at themselves, right? So, verse 7, and it says, we have dealt very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments nor statutes nor the judgments which thou commandest thy servant Moses, right? And Nehemiah was not only was he a type of individual who actually feared the Lord, he had, quote unquote, a high position, right? But, he didn't boast about his, his lofty position, because to be a cupbearer, you had to be very, very, trustworthy. You had to have actual morals, scruples, and so on and so forth, right? But one of the things here, he was still, because when people hear, okay, like say for example, if you equate it into today's terms, like somebody who serves like the CEO of Amazon or whoever, right? A lot of people, I'll just put it like that, might boast in, for example, their lofty position, so to speak, and then because of that, they think they can do no wrong. But Nehemiah, it shows you the type of quality of character that he had, to be accountable for his actions, because he realized, the Lord is doing this to us because myself and our nation, we slipped up, we made a mistake. We did this because, we're in this predicament because we went against the ways that the Lord instructed us to do, right? So, but, he still played a very, very instrumental role in trying to rebuild those walls of Jerusalem. He had to call out a lot of the BS amongst our people. There was a lot of our people back then that were doing a lot of shady behavior, right? They were, pushing usury upon their own people, oppressing their own people, right? And that's that is the same sentiment, when you really think about it, that occurs today. You have a lot of our people oppressing their own people, right? And the prophets are, trying to push that spirit of, accountable. You got to repent and turn back, right? But where was I? This is verse 9. Oh, I'm sorry. Verse 8. And it says, remember, I beseech thee the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, if you transgress, I will scatter you abroad among the nations, right? And that's exactly what happened. We got scattered, right? We get called a bunch of bywords, proverbs, and so on and so forth. Okay, let me get this here. Okay, this is Luke 18:9, and it says, and he spake this parable unto certain that trusted in themselves that were righteous and despised others. And it says, two men went in the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a publican. And the Pharisee stood, Yahushua speaking, and prayed thus with himself, Yahweh, I thank thee that I am not as these other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. So right here, he slipped up, because he's comparing himself amongst the publican, right? And Paul talks about themselves. We don't compare ourselves amongst ourselves, right? Because that's not wise, right? To roughly paraphrase. Verse 12, and it says, I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, Yahweh Bashem Shai, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you that this man went to the house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbled himself shall be exalted. So you see the very contrast in their behavior between the two individuals. One was more in that spirit of actually trying to justify and hide behind. I don't even want to say hide, but essentially it is hiding, because you're showing your righteousness and displaying your righteousness and saying, okay, I do this and I do that, right? And not acknowledging that you slipped up, right? Because we're not justified in keeping the laws. We establish the law, as Paul says, but we can't keep it 100%, right? So but then you see the contrast here in the mindset of the publican, because he actually admitted, like, okay, I'm a sinner. He was able to acknowledge his wrongdoing, right? So that's pretty much what I'm kind of getting at here. Is the element of acknowledging wrongdoing, regardless of how much we know, right? That's still part of good character, acknowledging our wrongdoing, so to speak, right? So, anyways, that's just a short, I guess, exhortation in terms of character, because character, is something I've observed, really and truly, is character really and truly, goes a long way, right? Acknowledging your wrongdoing, manners, etiquette, being peaceable, all these different things, man. Like it truly 100% goes a long way, right? Those fruits of the spirit definitely goes a long way, right? And it's very important, to have those things, because, like, if you have a lot of understanding and you can't acknowledge that you make a make a mistake, it's like, I don't know, it's just something very, very, you kind of like a child that's very undeveloped, basically, and it seems like you're like a child that's malnourished, so to speak, right? And wanting to know more precepts is good, not knocking those things, but the importance is, the milk is very, very, nourishing, and I mean that on a physical as well as a spiritual level, right? So I guess I'll leave it there, but I sincerely pray and hope that this lesson was edifying. I'd just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.